Hello, everyone. Great to see familiar faces. Great to see some new faces, especially to see new faces, because that means I can introduce the Writer Center to some people who maybe don't know it, as well as board members that I see in the audience and some of our fellow staff members as well. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the Artistic Director at the Writer Center. And the Writer Center is a literary arts nonprofit, and we exist to support writers and everyone who wants to write. We do that through about 300 creative writing workshops every year, and that's for all genres and for all experience levels. And since around 2000, when there was a big event in the world, we do a lot of those online as well as in person in our facility here. And then in addition to our paid workshops, we also do offer free events, which you are familiar with because you're at one right now. So we really hope that if this is your first time at one of our free events, if this is one of the first times you've been here in a while, that this isn't the last time we're going to see you here, because we have stuff in the building almost pretty much weekly, so just check out what we have going on. You can go to our website, writer.org, to see everything that we have coming up. We also have virtual programming as well, so, you know, a rainy day, check it out. We might have something going on where you may have to leave home. And then lastly, I do want to mention that we are the home of Poet Lore, America's oldest poetry magazine, in continuous publication for 134 years now, and the Writer Center has been publishing it since the 70s, since we acquired it then. So it's an amazing publication. My number one piece of advice for writers of every genre is read poetry, because poets are better at words than the rest of us, and that's the best way to get better at writing. So please read poetry, and Poet Lore is a great place to start. That's enough about the Writer Center, because we're not here for us. We're here for our guest of honor and a discussion with our co-guest of honor this afternoon. So I'm just going to introduce them real quickly. He gets top billing. He gets top billing, okay, that's fair. So I'll start with our top bill for the afternoon. David O. Stewart. After many years as a trial and appellate lawyer, he became a best-selling writer of history and historical fiction. His novel, The Lincoln Deception, about the John Wilkes Booth conspiracy, was called the best historical novel of 2013 by Bloomberg Review. Sequels include The Paris Deception, set at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, The Babe Ruth Deception, which follows Babe's first 2 years with the Yankees. Stewart's award-winning histories explored the writing of the Constitution, the gifts of James Madison, the Western Expedition and treason trial of Aaron Burr, and the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. In February 2021, they published his George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father, and we discussed that's had like a resurgence here. It sort of came out during COVID. We've had a little belated love for the George Washington bio, so that's great. And we're here today, of course, to celebrate The Burning Land, which is book 2 of the Overstreet Saga, and we do have books. I see some people have them already, but if you don't, the books, book 1 and 2 are available for sale on the back table after we're done here today. And then moderating the event this afternoon is Sally Mott Freeman, author of the best-selling book, The Jersey Brothers, a missing naval officer in the Pacific and his family's quest to bring him home, published by Simon & Schuster. She's an accomplished speechwriter, public relations executive, and nonprofit leader of more than 30 years. The Jersey Brothers was critically acclaimed. Smithsonian Magazine named it a top 10 history book of the year, and it was an Amazon Best Book of the Year in both history and memoir. It was also named the Best Book of the Year by Military Times, Navy Times, and Marine Corps Times. For several years, she was the chair of the board here at the Writer Center, and is now Chair Emerita and the current treasurer of our board of directors. So I will hand it over now to David and Sally. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, me too.
It's easier to talk to somebody when you can look at them.
Yes.
Thank you all for coming. This is great.
Well, let's see. Do I need a microphone? Oh, I have a microphone.
I'm on my knees for you.
That's good. Well, first of all, I loved the book, and I highly recommend it to all of you. It not only raised many critical issues regarding the Civil War, but also of some surprising civilian sentiment in the North. I appreciated the desire to tell the stories of our ancestors and the roles they played in wars that consumed this country. I'm going to read a couple of these questions because for those of you that know me, if I don't read the questions, we'll be here until 7 o'clock tonight because I love to digress and it's always interesting when we are on a timetable and want to allow time for questions. So, okay, Okay, so this book is historical fiction, in contrast to some of your straight nonfiction books. But The Burning Land is based on a true story about your ancestors, your great-grandparents. So I guess my first question is, how did you first learn about your forebears in Maine? And when did you have that aha moment that you wanted to write a story about their arrival in this country, which is part one of the trilogy, this one, which is the second book in the trilogy, and their involvement in the Civil War?
You know, my mother was a storyteller, and she told us all sorts of stories, and you know, some of them were true, it turned out. And as a boy, I very much admired a ring she had, and I was pretty young, and I said, you know, where'd you get that? You know, and she, you know, held it out and said, well, this was taken off your ancestor on a Civil War battlefield after he had been killed. And as a young boy who was really in love with history, that was the most romantic story I could imagine. And I was just totally swept away by that. And, you know, I sort of filed it away. And actually, Nancy, my wife, who's helping with this today, when we were first married, we went up to Maine. And I remembered that my family, my mother's family had come from there. So we went by the town. And I discovered all sorts of things about the family.
Waldenboro.
Waldenboro is the town. It's a little town now. It used to be bigger. It's on the coast. It was a shipbuilding town. My mother had insisted that we were Alsatian. That was the family, because she was a World War II generation and she could not acknowledge anything German. But it turned out our first arrival here in this country was Johann Gottfried Überlach. So he probably was German. As were his sons, Krauss and Friedrich. So it was a voyage of discovery from then on, discovering the things that were not true. And I discovered I was able to identify the ancestor who fought in the Civil War. He did, very honorably, but he did not die on a battlefield, which I suspect he was pleased with. And I just, the more I learned about it, you know how it is to get the Defense Department records and pension records. You know, the Army's pretty good at keeping records. And they may not keep them secret, but they can keep them. And they, sorry. This is what life is like.
A little 21st century.
In any event, so I was able to find out what happened to him. And the piece that really made the story compelling to me was he dies relatively young, I'll give that away. But his wife lives a long life, and actually my mother knew her.
Oh,
And she was my mother's great-grandmother. She was my great-great.
so this would have been Katie Nash.
Katie Nash, and I kept her name just sort of in tribute. She was a very memorable figure, even the little bit I knew about her. It's always harder to find out information about women than about men, just the records are less. But when I discovered what their trajectory had been, I just wanted to write the story. I had it in my head for decades. And I finally decided I was never going to know enough to write the nonfiction story, because we don't have letters, we don't have journals and diaries. And they were not important people, you know, there were not a lot of newspaper stories. So I figured I could make it up.
Well, I think that's one of the many wonderful things about the book, is that so much of what you read about the Civil War is about the generals and about the decisions that were made, both you know, in the South and in the North. And the fact that you tell a story about basically an everyday citizen who plied his trade in Maine, I think is a unique feature in the sort of the canon of Civil War stories. I love that about it.
Yeah, you know, I've done books on Madison and Washington, and it was nice to look at the world from the bottom up. And, you know, these are the people whose lives are turned upside down by war, and have to cope with the world that, you know, they didn't make.
Yeah.
So that was a pleasure to try to figure that out.
Well, that leads very nicely to my next question. You recently authored a great piece in American Heritage magazine entitled, "Did Johnny Come Marching Home with PTSD?" And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about PTSD during the Civil War. You sort of address it in various ways without calling it by name in the story. And perhaps how it has been addressed by our military and our society since then, how it's evolved.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a secret, and has never been, that war changes people, but those who fight it. You can see it in the Iliad, you can see it in, you know, the Epic of Gilgamesh. But, you know, we didn't approach it medically until the 20th century. And the Civil War soldiers had, many of them, had all of these symptoms that we would now identify as PTSD. And in that day, they called them cowards, malingerers.
It was a weakness. It was considered a weakness.
Yeah, and they weren't sturdy, self-reliant people who were willing to go off and kill. And, you know, I discovered a remarkable story that possibly the second most important Confederate general, James Longstreet, had an episode that was clearly PTSD in the middle of the war. He was wounded, and in his recuperation, he would weep uncontrollably, not knowing why. And, you know, he almost met death from his wound. Of course he would be upset. And the doctors then didn't know what to make of these symptoms. They came up with some fairly wacky theories for soldiers who got what we would call a panic attack, which was very much an elevated heart rate. They called that irritable heart syndrome. If you got depressed, which is one thing that can happen, they called that nostalgia, not like a Hollywood nostalgia. That was the term they used. And it wasn't until World War I that we got more thought about it among the medical people. And then it was called shell shock for the folks in the trenches who got bombed for, you know, weeks and months on end. In World War II, it was called combat fatigue, battle fatigue, and it's the same symptoms. And then the Vietnam generation really did develop this post-traumatic stress disorder approach. And the notion is that there was a wonderful piece in the Post a few weeks ago by Karl Marlantes, the great novelist who wrote Matterhorn about Vietnam. And, you know, he described his first patrol in Vietnam. And I'm not going to try to reproduce it, but it was riveting, and he basically said, my mind changed at that moment, and I would spend the rest of my life trying to change it back. And, you know, if you are facing death, if you are terrified, your mind changes. We know now that cases of sexual abuse, family abuse, that happens too. The same symptoms come up. So there is more understanding. What's interesting is that the therapies haven't really changed. You kind of suggest people rest and take it easy and talk about it. Take a pill to sleep.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Matterhorn, which my husband read and sent to a close friend of his who was at Khe Sanh in Vietnam, a general. They met each other at the Pentagon, and And he sent it to him because this man, who was ordered by his superior officer to fire on a ridge where his own men he knew were located. And I think I have that right. And he, to this day, we just were with them out in California, you know, suffers from that time. And he took that book, The Matterhorn, and sent it to our friend and said, I think you're going to be able to relate to this story, as I recall. And I saw that you mentioned that in your interview with the Civil War Museum, too. I would also like to say the Writers' Center has played a role in sort of the evolving way of addressing PTSD in the sort of Iraq, Afghanistan era, and soldiers returned, and you know they had various forms of TBD and traumatic brain injury and PTSD. And there was a project sponsored by NEA, and we were one of the organizations that helped implement it. It was called the Veterans Writing Project, and they would meet here, and they would be taught by veterans, and they were veteran-only classes. And some of those teachers, instructors, were actually veterans themselves whose own suicide was interrupted, or they failed in their effort, and they started to write as a form of therapy to recover. There's a term for it, which I'll think of in a second. And then fast forward after that, Walter Reed built a new center, and the Army was sort of the last to come to this idea that alternative therapies might actually help in recovery. You know, things like Reiki and meditation and mask making, and of course the writing program. And it's been very successful. It was so successful at Walter Reed, and we had our instructors from the Veterans Writing Project teach over at Walter Reed. It was so successful that it's been replicated at other bases and military hospitals around the country. So, is it the answer? Is it the you know the thing that changes it back, as Carl would have said, to what I was before? Possibly not. But I would just like to point out our proud history here at the Writers' Center in that regard.
And you know, in the book, I didn't want to make it a catalog of symptoms from PTSD.
Of course.
And you know, that's not how he would have thought of it, not how his, you know, the families were terribly confused by this. Family members came home profoundly changed. They didn't quite understand why, but they knew they were very difficult. And so you know, that's one of the virtues of fiction. I can portray that without having to get into clinical discussion.
You're really good at leading me to my next questions. You don't even know what they are. And here's the irony I think in war and in your story, where you have Henry Overstreet on page 201 explaining to his wife, who's a little confused by his behavior when he gets back, and he said, it's that sometimes I can't accept it. I can't accept that I'm here, that there won't be reveille in the morning before our 20-mile march, that I'm not eating hardtack and salt pork and water. And here, when he was, the section of the book where he's at war and they're at Gettysburg and other battles, all the men sit around and talk about is food and family and home and their desire to get back. And then they get back, and yet here is this sentiment. And this isn't just the Civil War. I would say it's all wars. I touched on it in my own book when Benny finally gets off the USS Enterprise and goes home, and then he's on the war bond drive, and he goes to talk to people about, you know, the successes that they've had in the Pacific and so on and so forth, and he describes what life on the ship was like. And he had written a letter about this, and he said as he was describing it, that he had this almost overpowering desire to be back there with the sailors, with the men, with the people he had fought with. And it's just one of those ironies.
Yeah, the intensity of the experience is not something that's much matched in civilian life. Probably that's okay, but
Yeah.
it is something that I think some of them miss.
Absolutely. So moving on to one of my favorite topics, women. women in all walks of life. But like many women left behind, when their men go to war, they cannot stand by and do nothing. And the Civil War is no different from World War II in that they just feel compelled. They cannot sit at home on the rocking chair, on the front porch and wait. And so you maybe talk a little bit about Katie Nash and what she did and how her various efforts sort of unfolded, somewhat improbably, but...
Yeah, it was hard to get into her character to understand it, not only because she's a woman and I'm not, but also there's just less evidence. But the thing that stuck with me was my mother's image of her as an old lady, which was she ran a Chinese laundry on the south side of Chicago, and she smoked a pipe. And
I noticed that.
That's pretty vivid. And it, you can build a lot on that foundation. And it just struck me that this was not a woman, even in the 1860s, when women's horizons were a lot narrower than they are now. It was not a woman who was just going to sit there. And so, in the story I have her get engaged with the Soldiers' Aid Society. Her then husband was terribly wounded in the next 5 months in the hospital. That is based on the war records. And I just assumed that she would go be with him. I mean, what else would you do? Because you couldn't count on doctors in the 1860s. You can't count on them now.
Right. But she started in Maine, knitting socks for the soldiers and sending, things that were unavailable on the battlefield, and then it morphed into her role as a nurse at a military, not a certified nurse, but as, in a sort of recuperation center. I think it would be hard pressed to call it a hospital.
She was a pair of hands who was willing to help.
Yes, exactly. So, and then I think when you were talking to the Civil War group, what is the name of that museum in Richmond?
Richmond Museum of History and Culture.
Richmond Museum of
Or
History.
Virginia Museum.
Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And you talked about sort of the rise of the nursing corps in the Civil War. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, because the numbers were quite remarkable.
Yeah, there were 40,000 nurses.
Yeah.
And that's both sides. So that's a lot of families where the women have, to use a 21st century phrase, have agency. They are out making a difference in the world. They're choosing what they want to do. And that's, all change is incremental in social matters, but that had to play a role. And you start to see it towards the end of the 19th century. The suffrage movements catch on. Women are very engaged in the teetotal movement, which is very much about protecting women from drunken spouses and drunken boyfriends. So, it is a change that's happening in society, and I think that was a part of it.
All right, a little bit about writing. We are at the Writers' Center, after all. As an author of both nonfiction work and historical fiction, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the differences in your approach to research and writing in each genre, and maybe also about the differences in the audiences that, the reading audiences that both genres, that each genre attracts.
I will get asked the second question, and that's a good one. The big difference is, subjectively for the writer, is one, I can make stuff up, and that's great. And two is I don't have to write footnotes, which is also great.
Yeah.
If I find something I think is a good source and I rely on it, I don't have to get the year of publication and the date and the page number and all that, which, is sort of
It's a lot of work.
a pain in the neck. it is interesting to me, and I haven't had a chance to talk about this much, the difference in the audiences. Because I find that nonfiction readers want you to tell them. They want you to tell them exactly what happened and then interpret it for them, explain it, and don't leave it to them. Whereas fiction readers, they're more interested in bringing themselves into the story, and you can just sort of have the man and the woman go off to the woods, and then to the next scene. We can fill that in, and that is in some ways liberating. You have to be very careful with a fiction reader because they will interpret stuff that maybe I don't mean. So that's one thing to look out for. But I do think there are often different readers. There are a lot of people who write both fiction and nonfiction, but it's not the prevailing. And I find it very gratifying to do both. But it is a different audience. If I am doing a history book, and these are my favorite people in the world, but it's old white guys. And they're wonderful, but that's who comes. And if it's fiction, even though it's historical fiction, a lot of women like historical fiction, and I get a more mixed response.
Based on a true story is very appealing.
Yeah, I like the Hollywood phrase, inspired by. It's really good.
Speaking of Hollywood, any thoughts on having any of your stories adapted for film?
I'll answer the
Do you hate that question as much as I do?
Yeah.
I just wanted to put it out there.
Producers here.
Next question.
So you do hate that question as much as I do. So this is a little esoteric perhaps, but I think it's an important question. Why should 21st century audience read about history and foreign wars, and, well, actually some of them not foreign war, but wars that consume our nation?
We're not done with war, and that's a shame, but we're not. We're pretty flawed. And the Civil War in particular, it's not over. It's only been 8 generations. But I remember when the Balkans blew up this was the 90s, and I discovered that the people in Kosovo are still ticked off about some battle in 1379, and thinking those people are crazy.
And look at the Turks. I mean, they
But in the Middle East, the Arabs still called Europeans the Crusaders. These wounds don't go away. They are in the culture for a long time, and we do need to understand them. We finished that war with a complete military victory and an almost complete social defeat for the North. And that is still with us. So the people who lost the war are still angry about that, and the people who lost the peace are angry about that.
Do you think it was more about angry about the loss in the conflict itself, or more about sort of a botched reconstruction process in the case of the Civil War?
Our reconstruction was completely unsuccessful. I mean, you can't argue with that. And it started out weak, and then got heavy-handed, and then it just went away. And it didn't really heal the wounds. So I think that's blood under the bridge. We can't do anything about that. But I think we have to understand what was going on, and what injuries have been passed on through every generation. And that our reparation, if you use the word, or its recovery from slavery is still incomplete. And that's an open wound.
I don't want to wade into policy here, but do you think that the proposals on the table today, things like reparations and other, would be effective in moving us past that?
I'm here to talk about the novel.
Okay. I can take it.
Good.
Although I do want to convey its relevance to the present day. So forgive the question, but that's why I asked it.
It's all there.
Yeah.
There is an African-American character who is...
Yes, she did a great job with him.
Escaped slave, and the war really matters to him.
Of course, right.
In ways that it doesn't quite matter as much to the white northern soldiers.
It was very interesting the way from you had the Copperhead, as you called it, from Waldoboro, Boss Reed, I believe his name was, and how I was surprised and had not come across this in previous reading, that he, because they built ships in Waldoboro, and what they moved with in those ships was cotton, and they did not want to lose that revenue. And he was part of a contingent of leaders, shall we call them, in the North that wanted to sue for peace, didn't want to necessarily have to end slavery. He just wanted to keep the cotton trade going because he was in the shipping business.
Yeah, Waldoboro was a Copperhead town, and they voted...
Maybe explain that term a little bit.
That was the Democrats who didn't want to fight the war. They thought killing their customers was bad for business. And
that's a better way of putting it.
They voted against Lincoln in both of his presidential elections. They were anti-abolition. And obviously there were people in town who were pro-abolition, and that was a very serious rift within the town. I mean, if your loved one is off fighting in a war, and you've got people next door saying it's a stupid war, that's an uncomfortable thing at best. And, there were a lot of places in the North where the feeling was like that. Southern Ohio, Southern Indiana, there was not a great deal of enthusiasm for the war. So, and in the South, there were mostly among sort of the hill people, there was a lot of unhappiness. They were fighting the war from their side. So there was a spectrum, and it was important for me to sort of portray that. I think there is this notion of the monolithic North being, committed to eradicate slavery, and it wasn't true.
My ancestor, Lucretia Mott, who was a Quaker and became a leader in the Quaker Church, was a quiet member of the Underground Railroad. And even in sort of parts north, Massachusetts, New England, Rhode Island, she had to do this very quietly because she was not supported by many members in the community. And it just comes as a surprise to people when you hear, well, the North thought this, and the South thought that, and the war was about slavery, and was it about states' rights, etc. It was much more nuanced within each of those communities, and I think that you pull that out really nicely. So, let's see. Yes. So you've written works of fiction and nonfiction, and you've published with different publishers. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about well, first of all, what's the most important thing a publisher can do, I guess, aside from the obvious publish your book? Have you found differences in different publishers that you embrace, or that there are certain unattractive features to certain, without naming names, of course? I just wonder about that.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's got different experiences. There's it's like the Black Beauty story. There are times when Black Beauty gets a dry stable and gets a nice meal and is rubbed down and everything's nice. And there's times she's ridden hard and put away wet. And that's life. But it is also publishers. And And then, you know, I was sort of cast out. You want them, pardon me, you want them, this is my bias, you want them not to screw up the book. So, you know, I'm old and opinionated enough to think I can mostly write it, so.
Oh, the editing process.
Yeah,
Yeah.
You know, fix the problems, but, you know, let's not get heavy-handed about it.
This is my book, not yours.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't your idea to do this. But you want them to be competent at the market piece, which is increasingly on the writer. It's not something they provide much help for. But you want them to understand it and to have good systems in place for that. You want them to pay you a big advance, which is a pipe dream these days. The advances are all sure. And the thing I've discovered, which is bizarre, is some of them are just terrible at covers.
The artwork.
Yeah, and I mean, one, I'm happy to say specifically, I was with a Penguin imprint, which is, you know, the biggest publisher in the country. And they produced this cover for my George Washington book that was hideous. I mean, it was kind of green and cream. And
no red, white, and blue.
Yeah, and I said, you know, I said, well, how about red, white, and blue? That's sort of the thing we work with here. And they said, no, this is great. And I said, you gotta be kidding, this is really, you know, ugly. And they said I should, like, go jump off a pier. And about 2 weeks later, my editor called me back and said, well, we're changing the cover. And it turned out they had taken it to Barnes & Noble, which at the time was still significant, and shown them the cover, and Barnes & Noble had said, you gotta be kidding. And so they did it in red, white, and blue.
I love it.
With stars and stripes. I mean, it wasn't that hard. But, you know, sometimes they get artistic, sometimes they just get off on the wrong angle. I mean, my first 3 novels, I hated the covers so much that one of my reasons for taking them over myself, and I've now put them out with another publisher, was so I could get better covers. I mean, it sounds silly, but
it does matter. Yeah.
All of you judge books by their cover.
And titles too. I mean, the titles also matter.
Yeah.
Well, I was told at 3:45 we wanted to start some Q&A, and I'm not sure if we're recording this, if we should be handing this around, or, but what do you think?
It's just
okay, Andy. Okay. So, questions? Ron.
Well, first of all, congratulations. This is your 10th book?
It is.
All right, congratulations, and wonderful to see you here, Sally.
Yes, I'm delighted.
So I'm interested about the divide between fiction and nonfiction. So maybe I can ask you a philosophical question. So when you're writing nonfiction, you're collecting data, right? But you have to put it together, right? And it seems to me that at that point, there's a certain literary, or if you will, fictional element that comes in play. Because you're not just putting together facts. By the same token, when you're writing fiction, all right, it's based on some element of reality out there. You may twist it, you may turn it, but... So can you just talk a little bit about the divide between fiction and nonfiction? And is it really that clear?
I mean, there's a lot. It's storytelling. And, you know, when you come to a story, you decide how you're going to tell it. Are you going to start... I mean, I did one book where I started with a dramatic scene at the beginning. It was sort of from maybe 2/3 of the way through the chronology, and then looped back to start at the beginning. And my editor said, don't do that. And I listened to her. I changed it. She was a big believer in chronology. Life happens chronologically. And, you know, it's a big thing these days now to do parallel chronologies in different centuries and stories. I don't play with that stuff so much. I may not be creative enough, but I just don't find it helps the story. I want to get to the story. I do think there is, with both types of writing, you do sit there and think, okay, what happens next? That's the recurring question. And with nonfiction, you have to go find out. But that may not be how you tell the story. You know, I may be introducing Ron Collins as a character, and actually, I need to tell you something about Ron Collins and this strange thing he did in college.
I'd rather you not.
But that's fiction.
And so that is, you know, you're playing with all of those, you're making those decisions. You know, in fiction, it's standard, you know, you gotta do flashbacks, you gotta establish character, and, you know, you can show a lot of that with the character, how they act, how they speak. But sometimes you really just need to talk about something that happened to the character. So there are a lot of similarities. I don't find them dramatically different, except two things I said, which was forget to make it up, and you don't have to write the footnotes.
I should disclose that Ron Collins is the founder of the Lewis History Book Festival, and he runs it together with Jen Mason and Lewis. And so he's seen a lot of both. I think they actually welcome both genre, but I'm sure you ponder that question a lot as you select your works each year. So.
And our first year, David came. So.
Yeah, and so did I. That's a big one later. In fact, it was the publisher of American Heritage Magazine in the conversation about it. Yes, yeah. Okay. And it's, for those of you who love Lewis, like we do, and love history, I highly recommend it. It's going to be at the end of September this year. They had their first in-person after two long COVID years that they did sort of on Zoom this past year, which was terrific. And it's expanded greatly over the years. It's really terrific, and it is the only history-specific book festival in the country. So I'm proud of it. Proud of you for founding it. Other questions? Yes, hi, Helen. Good to see you again.
To follow up on what Ron said, and I think you would agree, if you're doing a straight chronology, the beginning is not necessarily going to grab the reader. What you did with the Burning Land, which you put us in the middle of the battle scene, and I was hooked immediately. And I think that's what you were trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I did that because a friend of mine read the manuscript and he said, that Fredericksburg scene is so good, you gotta start with it. And, you know, the great Western novelist, Louis L'Amour, couldn't sell his first 5 or 6 books. And then finally, some editor called him up and said, put the gunfight at the beginning. And, you know, that's absolutely something, it's a useful thing to do.
Yeah.
So when you need to learn about something like, what is the standard of care in the middle of a Civil War battlefield, or post that in Waldoboro, right, Maine, in whatever year, do you do your research sort of as you come upon the fact that now you need to know something about that, or do you sort of try to think about the things that you need to know about before you start putting pen to paper, as it were?
Yes.
Just in time?
I try to research ahead of time so I can sit down and write, but you always miss issues. The phrase I tend to use is to write up to the hole, and suddenly you discover, oh, I really should be able to answer this question, and I can't. And then you stop and you go off and you story around and try to figure it out. So, the one thing I have changed over the years is in nonfiction, I can't just research for 2 years and then write. I need to research and write and research and write because I will forget it.
It takes longer that way, but I agree. the only way to do it. And even if you get it wrong after you've researched it and written it, you have a memory of what you read and what you saw. Even if you change it 10 times after that, I think it does take longer. I'll vouch for that. So, yes, the guy in the gray jacket.
So I read the first book and this one, and the thing that I have found, in addition to enjoying reading them, is a rather remarkable attention to the detail of everyday life. Now, you weren't there in 1750 on the boat, and you weren't in the stockade, you weren't on the hospital or the battlefield, but you have consistently what I've humanized the characters and the experiences with an extraordinary amount of detail as to their everyday living circumstances. And when I first started reading, I was a little, it was different. And I was a little surprised, and it sort of introduced a different character to the reading experience. And I guess my question is, I mean, you said you can make things up, but I found it extraordinary, the detail that was continuing throughout the stories, having to do what I would call the human condition of these characters. It was different from the historic part, but had to do with just day-to-day mundane activities, which sort of made them real people. And how do you do that?
I don't make that up. You know, I make up what they're thinking, what they're saying, and maybe what they do. But the internet's unbelievable. There's crazy people who are putting up YouTube videos about everything. And, you know, there's a scene in this book of slaughtering a hog. Now, I probably couldn't stand by and watch the process, but I sure was able to understand how it's done. I've had to do a couple of shipbuilding scenes in both books, and you know, I was using terms that I no longer know the meaning of, because, you know, at the time I wrote it, I understood what I was doing, but it's not part of my daily life. So you master the moment, the skill of the moment. And I think it's important context to see what people do. You know, how are they spending their lives? What does it smell like? What does it feel like? Those things are pretty universal.
So you say that there's now information out there, because there's a variety of experiences and scenes and circumstances, but rich in detail, really granular.
A lot of it's, I mean, specific things about what did the clothes look like, you know, what did they feel like. That's from the internet.
And what was the family unit like, and what was, you know, what were the copperheads like, and this, that, you know, I would say even in straight fiction, you didn't ask me, but you know, I have a wife. Even in straight fiction, you really have to have an accurate and authentic sense of the era that you're writing about, or you know, when you're writing about, you know, the Renaissance, you don't hear a toilet flush, do you? You need to understand the day-to-day in order to have people to go right into that era and feel that they're there. Sorry about that analogy, but right.
So the internet has become a huge tool, a research tool, for mundane experiences in detail.
Yes. So my first book was 2005, and the amount of additional information on the internet just in the last 18 years is amazing. So, Ken?
I want to go in a slightly different direction. I have tried writing family history, and it's a very difficult thing to do, I find, because when you write family history, the sensitivities about getting it right and the critical nature of the people who are going to read it in your family, who can pick out things that you don't get right, goes up. And this is not a strict family history, as you say, it's based on a family story, but you have a couple of real names, and it's based on a family story. So how did that affect this, in the sense of how did it affect your research, and how has your family responded? And were they your toughest critics, or are they your biggest fans?
No, my cousins don't know anything about our history, so they're just amazed at some of this. I have a lot of cousins,
Except that maybe they thought they were Alsatian.
Might as well. But, you know, for the first 2 books, everybody's dead. Everybody who knew these people is dead. I mean, they've been dead for 100 years. And it just makes it a lot less fraught. Book 3, which I am struggling with a bit, is the World War II era, and it's my mother's era, and her brothers, whom I knew. And I haven't even gotten the cousins yet. It's just a lot more complicated for me. You know, she was a load, but she was mom, you know. So it's harder, and you know, I haven't let my sisters see it yet. So I'm not sure we're going to end up with a published book on it. It's just one of those things. It's just, it is a load. I mean, Sally wrote about it.
Yes, actually, when David and I talked on Thursday about this very subject, because we both write about families and in the midst of a all-consuming war, and in my case, World War II, and I have living relatives, and you know, fortunately in my research, I found no axe murderers in the backstory, but
Well, that's what you said.
yeah. But you know, there were some things I had to be careful with, and I went and talked to family members about it. In my case, I went and interviewed every living family member. What did they remember? What, you know, what was their take? And rarely do these line up. Rarely, if ever. And but I had to go into it understanding what those sensitivities were. And the more I could layer on, in fact, I found diaries and many, many, many letters. It wasn't any longer, I wasn't any longer relying on what my memory or what, you know, my father was also quite a storyteller, had said about something. I had, you know, in their own words, what happened and who said what to whom and so forth. But I do remember at one point thinking, I'm going to end up at loggerheads with somebody. I mean, how could I possibly not? In fact, I did not. But I did worry along the way about it a little bit. So it's a great question, yeah, actually.
So I wonder if you could say a word about the role of dialogue in fiction versus nonfiction, since you've written both.
Yeah, if there's dialogue in nonfiction, it better be a transcript, because otherwise they're making it up, and it's a real red light. Put the book down, return it to the library. There are people who do it, they call it creative nonfiction, and I think it's a crock. And, you know, you can write a novel, go ahead, make it up.
Yeah.
But this blurring of lines is very wrong to me. The thing I like best about fiction, to be honest, is dialogue. You can convey so much, and some of this is from my trial lawyer experience. One of the stunning things trial lawyers learn is, Sally and I can talk about something, and we know exactly what each has said, and you look at a transcript of it, and you can't tell, because it was the gestures, it was the context, it was the history, and you know, it's just not clear. So you have to be careful when you're writing dialogue to make it clear. But you don't have to make it that clear. And you can leave some ambiguity. And, you know, you can also inject humor, which I like to do a great deal. So I view that as an opportunity. One of the things, you know, when I used to ride the Metro to work, it was a wonderful opportunity just to overhear people and just hear how they talk. And that, you know, we haven't had as many crowd situations for the last few years. And I I sort of miss that, because you do pick up terms of phrase and the way people communicate that is nonverbal, that can be very effective.
So you consider dialogue necessary in fiction?
Geez, I think it's fun. I mean, I think readers like it. You get all that white page, there's space on the page. It goes faster. Yeah, I mean, you know, oh Lord, who's the, Aaron Sorkin, who writes all the jazzy shows these days. I mean, the cliche for him is now people walking along, engaging in, you know, incredibly witty badinage back and forth. And it's fun. And, you know, readers like it. And it is a chance to be more clever than you are. I mean, you can, that great comeback you think of 2 hours later, well, you can get it in.
I would say on your response to that question, I do think that dialogue is important, and in the case of nonfiction, you can, as long as you footnote it, and as long as you say that conversation was drawn from an interview that Admiral Kelly Turner gave on thus and such, and recalled an incident that happened, you know, in the Pacific in 1944, etc. There are ways to avoid the creative nonfiction trap and also bring the conversation alive by pulling from letters and diaries and interviews of these individuals and recollections of others. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I would rather have a writer paraphrase what happens than put it in quotes, because if you put it in quotes, you're saying this happened.
Yeah.
And you probably don't know.
Right.
Maybe we should be thinking about
Yes, it's 4
refreshments.
o'clock. Yes, and featured, if this hasn't already been revealed, is apparently Nancy and David found some Gettysburg wine, and that will be served in the next room, maybe with a little salt pork and hardtack, perhaps?
Oh dear.
There is Tears of Gettysburg, which is a sweet wine, and it has all the virtues of a Gettysburg vintage. And there is a dry wine called Traveler. You seem not to have understood that that was Robert E. Lee's horse. And that also has some of the same virtues, some of the same qualities of Gettysburg.
Very friendly.
Thank you very much.
So anyway.